Dr. Nick, will you again please start telling us about HAARP?
Sure. The HAARP system is HAARP, and it's the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project operating here in Alaska, approximately 250 miles northeast of Anchorage. And it's a field of antennas, an array, if you will, which is 180 antennas are in the array. Each is about 70 feet tall, 72 feet tall, and then a cross dipole running perpendicular to the ground about 60 feet across. So a field of these, 180 in all, and what they actually do is focus or concentrate radio frequency energy into a relatively small area, and then by modulating it and shaping the energy itself, they actually couple to the ionosphere in a way that causes ionosphere to respond sympathetically to the instrument on the ground. You can think about it as just sort of plugging in, if you will, to the ionosphere for certain applications. In other uses, they can actually use the naturally occurring magnetic field lines that surround the Earth and literally wrap the energy around those field lines in such a way as to create an acceleration of electrons that would actually create an artificial missile shield using essentially instruments like HAARP on the ground. But those are just a few of the uses for the system. It's actually pretty versatile considering what it can do with radio frequency energy.
Now, does it predominantly is because I've heard a lot of until you tell me that they're absolutely correct, I'll say fairy tales. But I've heard that it can control the weather. I've heard it can cause earthquakes, cause tsunamis via earthquakes. I mean, is that true? Is the earthquake activity we're seeing now, is it potentially caused by HAARP?
Well, I couldn't draw those clear conclusions that the ones we're seeing now are caused by anything outside of nature, only because there's no independent monitoring of HAARP or systems like HAARP. But the idea that you can manipulate weather systems shows up in the original patents. And then when Dr. Eastland continued his work on HAARP, he did a couple of additional things after that project was underway. He did a report for the European Space Agency on methods of weather modification utilizing HAARP. He then went on to do a paper for the University of Pennsylvania on weather modification, where by 2005 he had determined that the amount of energy needed to manipulate weather systems and gravitational waves, which he felt were the root to geophysical manipulation, both in terms of earthquake generation and weather modification, you could actually modify weather with 1,600 times less energy than he originally thought was going to be required. And that's substantial, because that basically means that HAARP in its current configuration could have a tremendous impact on weather systems and perhaps even other global systems as a direct intentional effect, or as a side effect by an unintentional, uninformed user. And Dr. Eastland is now deceased. He passed away in 2007. So really the genius behind the technology is no longer around, and had not been attached to the project for well over a decade when he passed away. Now,
I've talked to several people that have, when I'm looking at the Weather Channel and I'm seeing the radar, and I know several people that are really hardcore into HAARP, and they say, look, that's a HAARP wave stopping that weather front there, and there it is again. And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is that what we're actually seeing, like when we're watching like the Weather Channel and we see a radar picture that just doesn't look quite normal?
Could be. There's a lot of systems that could account for this. Actually, in weather modification, there are several private companies and governments that have offered to provide that service for a fee. And so you would really have to look more closely, and this is the thing, is the signatures on these things should be pretty distinct. They should be noticeable and observable by anyone with the technology. And then secondly, the idea of being able to triangulate where those signals are coming from and how they're being broadcast is relatively simple for, again, a sophisticated government with the same capability. So it's not a technology that you can, hide in a silo. It identifies itself every time it's used if there's independent monitoring, and that is the problem. with the technology. There is no independent monitoring. The system is used intermittently as we understand it today, and it's not the only transmitter like it in the world or the only technology that can affect weather systems or other geophysical systems.
Now, I could see definite advantages. I'm thinking commodities right now off the top of my head. I mean, if you had a bunch of we know the Wall Street guys would never steal anything from us, but I could just imagine the money that could be made off of crop manipulation.
Well, there's a lot to be said for that, certainly. One of the more interesting applications of HAARP, however, is what's called earth-penetrating tomography, which is one of the reasons ARCO got excited, Atlantic Richfield, when they were first involved in this project before they sold it off, is this earth-penetrating tomography is like underground imaging. It's like, by analogy or comparison, it would be similar to like X-raying the Earth, only in this case you're using radio frequency energy, and it can actually get a very good resolution. And they proved this back in 1995 when HAARP that year was funded under non-proliferation and counter-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And the deal was, after the first Gulf War, they wanted to make sure that the underground imaging would be effective for underground facilities of various kinds. And then the other thing that came out of that was the ability to look and locate underground gas, oil fields of various grades, determine underground water reservoirs and certain types of minerals would also be defined here with a great deal of accuracy, like 99% accuracy in terms of where things were located. If you think about that in terms of oil and gas, and the whole concept of wildcat drilling goes out the window, because now you have full knowledge of what are otherwise public resources, because in the United States, in at least the western part of the country, those resources are owned in common by either federal or state governments. What happens is the situation when you lease those resources, you're disadvantaged because you don't have information about the resource. It's all speculation and risk. So the oil industry, the multinationals, gain tremendously in that equation. They have access to data. They're able to bid with greater knowledge than the public has, and as a consequence, the public gets ripped off on underbid, low bid royalty basis for production. And it's a big problem and will become an increasing problem as energy issues continue to move into the limelight nationally. And what we do on tax policy and developmental policy really needs to be scrutinized moving forward, because really the driver behind HAARP and many of these technologies are multinational corporations and their version of what's required in a civil society, which is quite contrary to what most people think is rational.
Now, that's interesting. I mean, you're basically stating that these multinational corporations, these oil companies, have every bit of oil inside of the earth mapped out, basically.
Well, they potentially do, and that's the thing is, when you look at it, why would you want to open the tap when you can still get $100 a barrel?
That's exactly, yeah, absolutely. That's incredible.
And it's not just here in the U.S. In fact, in Alaska, we're a big oil and gas region. In fact, 25% of all the world's undiscovered oil and gas is in the northern polar regions of the world, including Alaska. Alaska, I've been working on some areas unrelated to what most people know me for, but on coal resources here in Alaska, we have actually 2,000 years of domestic energy available and known resources for coal. We have 69 billion with a B, tons of coal at Tidewater in Cook Inlet, Alaska alone. When you start to think about energy resources and the opportunities presented by them, and the challenges as well, technologically there are challenges to overcome, but they're not impossible to overcome. They are possible. Energy independence for the United States would totally change the dynamic of the country and would eliminate 50% of the foreign trade deficit, which is significantly weakening our dollar. So energy as an issue is extremely important, and it was the driving issue behind HAARP initially, because what Atlantic Richfield wanted was a market for their natural gas on the North Slope of Alaska. And Alaska has tens of thousands of trillions of cubic feet of natural gas, and no pipeline to take it to market. But these systems require huge amounts of energy, and so the thought was that they would take the natural gas, convert it to electricity through magnetohydrodynamic generators, and then turn that electricity into radio frequency energy, run through a series of these arrays for creating the defense applications that were sought by the Department of Defense and others. And for ARCO's perspective, you couldn't ask for a better deal. I mean, if they actually could have done it, they would have had a market for their gas, had very little capital investment, and been able to sell billions and trillions of cubic feet over a period of decades. And so that was their driving force behind it. And then, the military took this project on, and then as it moved away from ARCO, and ARCO was later dissolved and sold to ConocoPhillips, these patents moved to E-Systems and then over to Raytheon, which is well known for their missile system, the Patriot missile system, among others. And then it moved to British Aerospace, interestingly enough, which now controls the patents, and it moved from the Air Force and the Navy over to DARPA, which now controls the project.
Now, I want to cover, because, I mean, there's speculation over China had a quake a few years ago, and then Chile, and now Japan, and I want to cover some of these things that I see on YouTube, like people report, we get a massive earthquake, and then they say, well, that day, look at the clouds, and they show a video of the clouds that day, and they're in literally like a grid pattern, like square grids, or the entire skyline will be rainbows. I've never seen an entire skyline of rainbows naturally. I could be missing something, but what are your thoughts on the clouds or the rainbows preceding an earthquake? Is that HAARP related?
Well, I don't know that, but I can tell you that during the Great Alaskan Earthquake, which precedes any of this technology in 1964, ionospheric disturbances were created, and they thought that was from a piezoelectric effect of the Earth plates rubbing against each other, creating a static discharge of some kind. And so lights and even lightning and lights and light effects are often associated with great quakes naturally. Now, the other issue that sort of comes up, and this was something that really wasn't well known or well observed until the Great Alaskan Earthquake, where it was observed. Now, having said that, China asserted at one point that the U.S. was responsible for the generation of an earthquake. Hugo Chavez made the same claim during the Haitian earthquake. Who knows? I mean, the problem is man now has that capability. In fact, I'll read you a quote from Secretary of Defense William Cohen. It comes out of our book called Earth Rising, the Revolution, but the quote was from a DOD news briefing, a Department of Defense news briefing that took place in April of 1997. So now this is before the 9/11 event, and it was interestingly, he was in just prior to this, he was in a conference on terrorism and weapons of mass destruction and U.S. strategy. The date was April 28, 1997. He was lecturing as Secretary of Defense with Senators Lugar and Nunn, and ending that was a DOD news briefing, and he said, the Secretary said the following, and I quote, "Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism where they can alter climate, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves," unquote. Now, what's important there is this is a seated Secretary of Defense suggesting that terrorists, people that are generally not known for high science, might have that capability. And yet we have that capability. In fact, we signed treaties with the former Soviet Union and 60 other countries in the mid-'70s where we agreed to not use geophysical manipulation as a weapon of war. And what's important about that is that predates some of the chemical and biological treaties, some of the nuclear disarmament treaties that have gained so much currency in the news, and no one ever heard about this one, and yet it was important enough decades ago to create a need for the legislation internationally. And what we would suggest is that what has happened in the interim is much, much greater than what was ever anticipated in those early research days.
Now, what you just read off is, or you're stating that the government's agreed not to use this as a means of warfare, but Eisenhower said it best. He was talking about the private military-industrial complex. We're not dealing with governments anymore. We're dealing with corporations that operate.
And they operate outside the law and outside of the Freedom of Information Act, outside of public disclosure and scrutiny. And you are absolutely right. And there was at least two attempts in the Congress on the House and Senate side to introduce a bill that would restrict both commercial and military uses of weather modification, and the bills just never moved. And the reason was because of exactly this. What happens, say a private company offers a farmer the opportunity to bring rain to his fields, but in the course of doing it denies the neighboring country the access to rainfall. Now, if you're the neighboring country, you might consider that an act of war. You might consider that an intrusion on your sovereignty in the sense that they've short-circuited your ability to get rainfall. Rumsfeld wanted that treaty abandoned when he was in a position to have an influence because he really looked at it as a great opportunity. I mean, think about it. If you could wage a weather war or create a natural disaster in a country instead of waging an overt war, once the natural disaster occurs, you're likely to be invited in to help clean up the mess as a friend of an adversary instead of his foe. And yet you may have been the very reason that he's got the problem in the first place. And Rumsfeld thought that was great. He thought that was one of the greatest ideas ever because total plausible deniability. It was God. It was nature. And yet here we are playing that role as the wizard behind the screen, and that's the problem with so much of the military technology today.
Now, you talked about monitoring HAARP, and that right now there is no monitoring of it. Are you actually talking about a third party actually in the HAARP facilities monitoring them, or how would it be possible for regular people to monitor it?
Well, it's not, and that's the problem, is the average person can't do it. It requires too much equipment and too much equipment. But I can tell you, from a governmental perspective, monitoring HAARP becomes analyzing the emanations coming from it, which can be done with satellite-based technologies by many governments of the world, if they're paying attention and decide to look at it. And I would suspect that some governments are in fact doing that. I'm sure there's some dialogue at a very high level about, because ultimately these are the technologies of our century and the ones that will decide how they serve or conflict with the population's interest. The problem right now is, and what Bernard Eastland said in less than a year before he died in a conversation with me and a number of others, was that basically weather modification should not be in the hands of militaries for sure, on the basis that if they, in their research, without consideration of the rest of the planet, they're going to make mistakes. And if we're going to proceed, if we're going to proceed in any of these areas, it needs to be military help, weapons technology, and playing with the environment at this level is high risk. And if you look at the biggest environmental messes on the planet, they are related to militaries, including in our own country. And that's an important aspect to remember. They've never been accountable as stewards of this planet, and they never will be. It's up to the rest of us to put in the box a definition of what is reasonable and rational in terms of experimentation when the very ecosystems we all depend on become at risk. Absolutely.
Let me ask you, so what we're dealing with, now I want to clarify really quickly, who owns and controls HAARP specifically?
That facility is controlled by DARPA, which does research primarily for the military industrial complex and particularly security agencies within the United States.
Okay, so they're actually private then, is that correct?
No, that's a public organization, DARPA, and it is part of the DoD, and they do cross the spectrum for all branches of the military and security side for the government. They engage most of the highly classified research. and then they make sure it's disseminated across the board. Tony Tether, who used to head DARPA, was Ben Easton's close friend and responsible to a large degree of advancing many of these principles.
Now, let me ask you, have you ever had reports of clandestine or private corporations creating their own HAARP facilities?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And what other countries, obviously Russia and I'd assume China, what other countries potentially have or do have HAARP technology?
You got to restate that for me. I'm sorry.
Well, like the United States, we've got HAARP, so I'm assuming Russia's, if there were treaties to not use weather warfare against each other, I'm assuming that Russia and China, possibly Japan, maybe the Koreas have similar installations.
Oh, yes. Russia and China, and then the Europeans to the EasyCat system, and then Rosalie Bertel has reported that we have similar systems across Canada. So, yeah, that is all out there. In fact, the Chinese, in response to us having them, actually began advancing this technology. The Russians have objected. They've passed a Russian Duma resolutions opposing HAARP, as has the European Parliament, for both environmental and health reasons in particular, and importantly, really because of the nature of the risks. And that's what has come out loud and clear when anyone has totally looked into and scrutinized. And of course, you got a lot of, like you say, that is disturbing because it's not based on good, hard evidence. When people look at the work we've done on the subject, when Gene Manning and I first published Angels Don't Play This HAARP, the book on the subject, we used 350 source documents, and these weren't phone calls and clandestine meetings. These were hard documents from academic studies, non-classified military records, and mainstream media reports. And that's essentially what we've done for the last 15 years. In the books we've published, over 1,600 sources are cited, any of which can be analyzed and looked at by third parties, and people are going to come to the same conclusions we have, which consistently they have over this period of time. You guys.
No, okay, there you are. I love Skype.
I know sometimes it's the technology. It just doesn't serve us well sometimes. There you go.
Is Angels Don't Play This HAARP available through earthpulse.com?
Oh, yeah, and most bookstores can get it. But, yes, earthpulse.com has it, and a number of our other publications. And there's a lot of material there that's free that you can take as sort of condensed articles and so on, and we encourage people to use those and pass them on.
Now, how many HAARP facilities are there that you know of throughout the world?
At least a dozen, and that includes Arecibo, Puerto Rico for the U.S., the EasyCat system, particularly the one at Tromsø, Norway, the Chinese transmitter, the 5 older now Russian transmitters, and those are the ones that I'm aware of. And there's a few of them are cited, again, within the book, and they go back, actually, to the earliest versions of the 1970s, which were the old transmitters based in the Soviet Union that caused what was referred to then as the woodpecker signal. Uh-huh. And that was that kind of a clicking noise on ham radio operators, and they were able to triangulate that signal for these transmitters. And in the early days, they actually called them ionospheric heaters because of the effect they would have on the ionosphere. And they would literally systems change the direction of jet streams, and more importantly, any object coming in contact with that atmosphere that wasn't supposed to be there, like a satellite or some other object traveling at a high velocity of speed, would essentially malfunction and crash. And what's interesting is the Russians actually put forward an idea to the Strategic Studies Institute in London some time ago, suggesting that we use these systems for asteroid, comet kind of devices, because most of those incoming objects and space debris, they burn up when they hit the atmosphere, and they've got about 30 miles to hit that atmosphere and burn up before they hit the ground. And most objects do, or they become so fragmented they're not a huge threat. Now, imagine if instead of 30 miles, you could push that atmosphere out for 200 miles.
Wow.
You get nearly 7 times as much burn time to get rid of those big objects. And that was the idea of the Russians is, hey, we may be able to use this to take care of some real threats at some strategic moment if we can project the trajectory in and line these things up in the correct way. So that continues to be raised as a potential use either as an anti-satellite weapon or something to protect us from space debris incoming, and then as a side effect or a deliberate effect, the alteration of jet streams and localized pressure systems.
Now, I've got to ask, I've heard what you just laid out is interesting to me. I did not know Russia proposed that. I always hear people talk about the red risk and those Ruskies, but if I'm not mistaken, did Russia not actually even offer the services of their weather modification to farmers in Russia at some point?
Yeah, they offered it for the Olympics, and so did China. And then if you remember back when there were those huge fires in Indonesia a decade or more ago, and in fact it had to be a couple of decades ago, and those fires were burning and causing a huge air pollution problem in Malaysia. And the Russians, a private company in Russia, actually offered to create an artificial cyclone and just blow it all out of the area. Now, that was reported in Barron's and I believe the Wall Street Journal. It's cited in our book for the exact citation. But again, here's private companies offering to solve one problem without any consideration for what might happen somewhere else. And therein lies the biggest part of the problem, is you cannot model the entire planet and all of its systems accurately enough to predict the outcome when you're tampering with it. And we already see, just based on what we're looking at around the world, a very unstable set of geophysical systems already, and now man is adding even more chaos to an already chaotic system.
Let me ask you, did the United States government ever have, I have to ask this, it seems like they were looking at it entirely as a weapon system. Did they ever offer anything positive for the usage
the DoD
of it?
is not in the business of doing research just for the fun of it, and they only do it for weapons application. That's why they spend the money on it. There were a couple of ideas that Eastland had that unfortunately never got explored, to my knowledge. One was the idea that you could trigger ozone production. In other words, in the atmosphere, where in the place where they say it's being depleted, if that truly is the climate change issue, seems to me that would have been an important use. The other was specific pollutants that are contributors to greenhouse gases can be altered by creating, through radio frequency energy, chemical reactions that neutralize certain pollutants in the environment. And so to sort of cleanse the environment in terms of the atmosphere and then adding ozone in, the opportunity was there, but it was never explored as far as we know. The other things, obviously, from a defense perspective, if you're in the DoD, there's all kinds of advantages to HAARP in terms of the other applications, the idea of being able to locate underground facilities, obviously, the idea that same particular wave length can be used for communication with submarines at depth, providing a different option for that type of communication. The idea of over-the-horizon radar applications and some others that are associated with that come out in the patents, and the idea that you can disrupt global communications while maintaining your own in the same way that a solar flare does randomly affect the ionosphere. Here, man can create the same kinds of disturbances that impede the ability to communicate globally. And so these are all important from a defense perspective, but again, need some very careful considerations before they move forward. The other is the biological effects that come into play when these systems actually interact with human beings, or in the case of affecting magnetic field lines that surround the planet, these are often associated with the ability of migratory species to migrate. They have to be able to orient against those magnetic field lines. So when you disturb them, you put at risk those migration patterns, and that's where you can start to get some serious problems in conjunction with what people rely on for food and for migratory species.
Let me ask you, I want to get into the mind altering applications or even mind control. But first, I want to ask you. I want to get into the side effects or the repercussions of using HAARP. But could HAARP not be used to contain the radioactive fallout from the Fukushima plant in Japan?
That I couldn't comment on. I don't have any information that would answer that question.
Well, let me ask it in a different way. With them being able to redirect the jet stream, could they literally control where in the United States the fallout goes?
Oh yeah, now that's another question. And you move it someplace else, and the answer is yeah. I think they probably could, whether they utilize HAARP or even some other systems that are out there. That I would think is more possible. The thing about it is, and maybe the bigger lesson learned from this event in Japan is that we are equally as vulnerable, maybe more vulnerable, when you look at the location of nuclear power plants on fault zones within the United States. Something that the industry has obviously lied to us about, or basically just ignored, and could pay the piper in Congress in terms of what we used to call bribery, and now we give the nice name of a campaign contribution, because that's essentially what's done a lot of this. I mean, if you look at the repercussions of bad policy, it's because money drives the policy decisions, and I don't say that lightly. My father was a member of the United States Congress, the 92nd Congress. My brother Mark is currently sitting in the United States Senate, and I know how it works. And it doesn't work in the interest of the average person. It works against our interest.
Oh, I agree. I've looked into. They've got top secret clearances, and then they go into the realm of the private military industrial complex, and they've got what they call special access programs that, like you said, they never meet the Freedom of Information Act, and
they're done specifically to avoid it. In fact, the other thing they utilize are what are called technical memorandums, which are considered private communications between parties. The one that developed HAARP was actually over 600 pages in length, involved over 80 different government contractors and companies, and was distributed by the government. In the very first page, it says this is a non-published document. This is not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. This is a private communication. And the thing is 2 volumes, several inches thick. And it's like, I mean, I've been in government a long time, but, a memorandum over 600 pages ought to grab your attention. And the guy that distributed that memorandum was actually caught on film by Canadian Broadcasting in an interview denying its existence, and his name was on it because he was the one who distributed it. And they had a copy because we got a copy, and it wasn't classified, so we didn't violate any laws. But this is how they sidestep the Freedom of Information Act. The Freedom of Information Act is just another thing to get around for government agencies. It's another thing that's inconveniently in the way of their progress. But people need to remember that Freedom of Information Act was created in the mid-1970s, in 1976, in the aftermath of Watergate, when we found out that so-called ex-CIA people were breaking into Democratic headquarters, stealing records from doctors' offices. I mean, this is a corruption that has never gone away. They just changed names, changed programs, and passed it off to the private sector as now their obligation if they want to keep playing ball with the Pentagon. And these whistleblower rules, these reaches of the Freedom of Information Act, need to stretch across government and move into the private sector, wherever the private sector is spending the public's money. We ought to be able to reach in there and find out what's going on, and they ought to be subject to the same disclosures as our government is when they're using government funds, which is our funds, to work against our interests particularly. And there ought to be whistleblower mechanisms that go beyond government, that apply to the private sector, that when companies are engaged in activity that's contrary to human interests, that there's a way for people to come forward and blow the whistle. And right now there isn't. We need new institutions to make government accountable and new institutions to make corporations, multinational, soulless corporations, accountable for something besides just making money.
The scariest part is I agree with you, but when we look at, as you said, these soulless international corporations, they're getting their own mercenary armies gathered up. I mean that
Blackwater. Now I guess they changed their name because they got such a
yeah.
bad rap. But but they're not the only ones. I mean, look how many of these guys we're using. In our foreign conflicts. Mercenaries for practical purposes. I mean, and when you think about it, the Wikipedia leaks. And everybody has mixed feelings about that. But the one thing that I think everyone should recognize is, when you've got your diplomats going around looking for credit card receipts, trying to figure out who they can blackmail or threaten in order to coerce them into acquiescing to whatever it is that we want as a policy question, aren't we doing the same thing that we criticize our adversaries for? Aren't we dropping to the cesspool level of politics that every one of us across the planet, I don't care where you live or what kind of government you live under, isn't that what just totally disgusts us about the idea or the concept that somehow got lost in the shuffle of by the people, for the people, and of the people? Hasn't it changed to buy the corporation, for the corporations, for as much money as they can squeeze out of the rest of us?
Oh, absolutely.
That is the reality that we're living in the 21st century, and our technology is now the platform by which greater levels of manipulation and control of every aspect of our life comes into play. And the revolution that people are feeling in their hearts is a revolution that demands change and bringing back the being in human being and bringing us back to a rational approach to our technologies. Because militaries, they want to accuse us of being paranoid. Think about the military's role. Their job is to think of every horrible thing that could ever happen and try and figure out a way to avoid it. That creates some pretty paranoid thinkers, and those paranoid thinkers are driving way too much of government's policy, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Oh, I agree. It's hypocrisy. What you laid out it's hypocrisy, and it's running rampant. It blows me away. Let me ask you. You mentioned that the usage of HAARP can mess up the magnetosphere, which in turn messes up the internal compasses of animals, and humans have that also, not really used. But what if we really wanted to go into how far can HAARP go as far as implanting potential thoughts or maybe even moods? Could HAARP be used to turn a docile crowd, a peaceful crowd, into a raging mob?
Not so much on that small of a scale. It's more going to affect a larger geographic area. The idea that it could change the relative behavior or emotional state of people actually goes back to research done by J.F. Gordon MacDonald when he was at UCLA. He was later a science advisor to Lyndon Johnson. And then after that, he was published in a book called Unless Peace Comes in 1969, where he suggested if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, we could return a signal to the Earth that would manipulate the behavior of most of the people in contact with the signal. That same idea was echoed a few years later in the early 70s in a book by Zbigniew Brzezinski called Between Two Ages, where he took the same concept and amplified it a little bit further. HAARP is the first system that's been designed that can do that. It happens that the Earth-penetrating tomography, this idea of sort of looking into the Earth several kilometers deep that we were talking about earlier, the frequency range that operates on is 1 to 20 hertz, or pulses per second, which correlates with predominant brainwave activity in human beings. And what is known is what's called a frequency following response, an FFR, where the mind will lock on, the brain will lock on to this external signal and begin to mirror that signal, follow that signal, in such a way as then the brain emotional state will shift as the chemistry in the brain shifts as well. Now, this is a well-known principle that they can utilize light, sound waves and conditioned in a certain way, electromagnetic fields, radio frequency energy, and other means. In fact, there's a great article in terms of crowds and smaller systems. The article is called "The Mind Has No Firewalls." It was produced by the U.S. Army War College in the winter of either 98 or 99. And we quoted in our book, Controlling the Human Mind, which is an expose on this whole topic, going well beyond anything that HAARP would propose to do, and taking a look at the broader picture of those weapons systems that have been developed and the research along those lines, which goes back many decades, separate from HAARP, along many other lines. In fact, some of the early disclosures when the CIA was finally beat up after the Watergate event, there was actually a report that was issued, a presidential report investigating the CIA, and in those investigations, one of the things that came out was the use of mind control technologies in their advancements. And today, on our website, you can actually see the current Navy protocol for human experimentation, which actually calls out specifically mind control experiments, which have to be approved by an undersecretary of the Navy. But that protocol was approved in 2006. Page 9 of it is where you'll find the reference to mind control, and you'll see it right on our website at earthpulse.com under the mind effects section. And there's a tremendous amount of data there from DARPA and others that get into this issue pretty broadly. And then there's some early stuff from some of the early work in this area that was released looking at what we used to call the Iron Curtain countries research and what they called in those days paraphysics or parapsychology and the related fields. But all of this was tied up in research beginning as far back as the 1920s, but really getting a shot in the arm after the Korean War, when brainwashing became the sort of question mark in everyone's mind as we had returning North Korean prisoners of war that had totally changed their personalities. And therein launched a huge initiative within the United States to sort of pursue how to do that. And that continues to this day. And in fact, the last RFP we saw on these types of technologies were released a couple years ago, and University of California won a couple of bids for electronic telepathy, for looking at that whole concept, among many, many related areas. But mind effects don't just relate to HAARP, but HAARP indeed can affect emotional states over broad geographic areas.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, we've got 11 minutes left. There's a couple more questions I want to get out, but you know, the United States has always had it's a pattern. You know, we go into a economic decline, and we always have a war to come back out of it.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Let's take 9/11 for example. We can look back, and at the very least, most people can agree. Well, no, not all. You know, there's 1,000,001 theories as to what happened, but what everyone should agree on is that, well, no, not all our questions were answered, yet we were goaded into a war. Iraq definitely did not have anything to do with that event. But right. Do you think that they could use HAARP to would it be just to affect emotional states, or could they actually put in a generic coded message into the frequency? In other words, could they create fear and anger that would drive the overall masses to approve of potentially non-ethical decisions as far as going to war, is where I'm trying to go with that.
Yeah, I think they can create a situation like that. You can do it a lot of different ways, but you can create a complex signal that would create that sense of anxiety. In fact, it was Persinger at Laurentian University suggested this as one way to do it, is you create this overall sense of anxiety, worry, fear, dis-ease, and then in the normal 6 o'clock news, just indict some group or some ethnic group or some country for the source of all of your ills, and a certain amount of that anger and frustration would be immediately vented in that direction. So you know, it'd be as simple as that, but you could apply that principle more broadly or more in a more focused way with a number of other technologies. But the point being, many researchers have pointed out that this is not just in the realm of science fiction anymore. It's possible. In fact, when we testified in the European Parliament back in, it was in 1998, February of 98, I had taken with me an infrasound device, which has been talked about in the literature, but no political body, to my knowledge, had ever seen one operating. And as a consequence, in a resolution that was passed a year later in 1999, January of 99, the sections that preceded are the sections regarding HAARP that we were responsible for, and the following we were also responsible for. And it says, and I quote, and this is European Parliament Resolution A4-0005/99. And it says in Section 27, and I quote, "It calls for an international convention introducing a global ban on all developments and deployments of weapons which might enable any form of manipulation of human beings," unquote. Now, the way we got that in there is I took in over 3 feet of documents, unclassified documents, to make the case, and then I demonstrated a device in front of the Parliament subcommittee that was putting this resolution together, which is a subcommittee on security and disarmament under the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Security and Defense Policy. And what happened is the resolution did pass. We had one debate. I was supposed to have 15 minutes to present the information. They gave me an hour and a half after the questions were answered. Then they assured me that they would get to the bottom of it. They would look into it, and they did, and they progress. But the treaty dialogue we are far from, and the reality is the technology has advanced another generation in the decades since. But we've stayed with it. We've broadened the discussion. I mean, this morning I'm talking to you, or this afternoon, or earlier this morning I was talking in South Africa. We are around the world talking about this issue on radio and through other medium. And one day the issue, I think, will be resolved, or at least we'll get a proper airing in public debate.
Let me ask you, we've got about 7 minutes left. We actually do this interactively with our shtf411.com chat room, so there's a lot of people participating with questions through there. But are there any positive, should HAARP technology, to a degree, it obviously is not that complicated if, quote, terrorist groups can build these things. Are there any positive, like micro-scale things at this? You did mention awesome things. I mean, overall, is HAARP good or is it totally bad? Is it evil?
Well, this is interesting. Dr. Eastland was pretty open about it, and he put a number of we had him in a closed conference in Dallas when I was executive director for the Lay Institute, along with a number of other scientists. And the way Eastland presented his work was he presented those things that he thought were all green-lit, things that really didn't present high negative risk, that provided solutions to maybe complex problems. The other set of ideas, which included HAARP, had both sides of the coin, so to speak. On the one hand, it had some potentials that were quite good, both for defense and for other reasons. And then on the other hand, the risks were identified. And here's where Eastland, as he matured as a researcher and scientist, where he was in the last few years of his life, from my perspective, as somebody who was an activist beating up his technology, okay? He was very fair-minded and very open, and his view was that really scientists needed to pay more attention across the disciplines because you miss a lot when you don't have all that background. Now, the way we approach our science in the U.S. runs counter to that. We compartmentalize, separate, break down all our science in the smallest bits possible so no one ever gets the whole picture. Well, the former Soviet Union did the opposite. They combined multidisciplinary teams so that nobody would miss the picture, if you follow what I'm saying. So they would get the whole view, that they would get the benefit of each other's discipline and develop a higher, better science. Well, they couldn't keep up with us in production, but they sure kept up with us in science and even surpassed us in a few areas. You remember, they were up in space before we were. But they did it because of the way they approached scientific research. Now, the downside for them, if you violate the rules, you go through courts and trials, and there you go through a really abbreviated system during the Cold War. So, the situation was different. The other thing in a centralized government like what you had in the former Soviet Union, your best minds were literally plucked out of the crowd and put into these kinds of programs to advance the national objectives. And so, and today that happens in China on a population base, 4 or 5 times ours. There's a lot of talent to pull out of a pool of intellect. And that's what's going on still in some parts of the world. But these areas of science continue to advance in many, many parts of the world, following many parallel paths.
Dr. Nick, we only have about 4 minutes left. There's a few questions I'm not going to be able to get to, obviously, and we don't have much time, but let me ask you the tinfoil hat question. Uh, are there methods possibly on your site that we can test ourselves to see if we are being affected by HAARP? Are there ways to block out the HAARP signals?
There's no practical way. At one point we thought there might be, but I'll tell you, as a practical matter, and I get asked the question all the time, and there is no single defense. I mean, I can say that, except for changing the name of the game. The program has to change, and what's going on right now is what our military calls a revolution in military affairs, an RMA. They equate it to when atomic weapons were introduced in the last century, or a few centuries ago when gunpowder was introduced to Europe. Today, that introduction is energy-based weapon systems. The weapon is something you don't see. It's not like a bullet or a bomb ripping and tearing tissue. It'll be subtle energy that they use to disrupt communications, hardware and software systems, and ultimately the controlled effects of the human operator. In fact, Technology Horizons, produced by the U.S. Air Force Research Lab, the Electromagnetic Directorate did a cover story in June 2004 that talked about the controlled effects on humans, and the objective of the military is to be able to override all 5 of the human senses to such a degree as they could create complete hallucinations, holograms, if you will, of experience that you could not determine whether it was synthetic or whether you actually experienced it. And that should be a startling wake-up for most people, the fact that the government is actually pursuing this as a good idea. The interference with free will, the interference with the mind itself as a fundamental aspect of what we hold sacred, at least we think we do. As we say, we hold sacred the freedom of speech and assembly and religion, which are all predicated on the idea of freedom of thought. And that's what our governments are playing with. Not just in this technology, but in several technology areas that we've disclosed over the years.
It's sickening. It's really sickening. Dr. Nick Begich, we are out of time. Will you give us your website one more time? And I would like to ask you to come back on the program sometime. You are extremely informative, and we just did not have enough time.
We'll do it again sometime. The website, again, is EarthPulse, EARTHPULSE, earthpulse.com.
All right, Nick, I appreciate it. You were awesome. You were great. The people loved you. I'm reading their comments right now. So,
well, thanks for having me, and we'll do it again sometime in the future.
Bundle up before you go outside up there.
No kidding. At least we're in the 40s today.
All right, sir. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me. Take care now.
All right, you too. Good night. All right, folks. That was Dr. Nick Begich. It predominantly is because I've heard a lot of. Until you tell me that they're absolutely correct, I'll say fairy tales. But, I've heard that it can control the weather. I've heard it can cause earthquakes, cause tsunamis via earthquakes. I mean, is that true? Is the earthquake activity we're seeing now, is it potentially caused by HAARP?
Well, I couldn't draw those clear conclusions that the ones we're seeing now are caused by anything outside of nature, only because there's no independent monitoring of HAARP or systems like HAARP. But the idea that you can manipulate weather systems shows up in the original patents. And then when Dr. Eastland continued his work on HAARP, he did a couple of additional things after that project was underway. He did a report for the European Space Agency on methods of weather modification utilizing HAARP. He then went on to do a paper for the University of Pennsylvania on weather modification, where by 2005, he had determined that the amount of energy needed to manipulate weather systems and gravitational waves, which he felt were the root to geophysical manipulation, both in terms of earthquake generation and weather modification, you could actually modify weather with 1,600 times less energy than he originally thought was going to be required. And that's substantial, because that basically means that HAARP in its current configuration could have a tremendous impact on weather systems and perhaps even other global systems as a direct intentional effect, or as a side effect by if you think about that in terms of oil and gas, and the whole concept of wildcat drilling goes out the window, because now you have full knowledge of what are otherwise public resources, because in the United States, in at least the western part of the country, those resources are owned in common by either federal or state governments. what happens is the situation when you lease those resources, you're disadvantaged because you don't have information about the resource. It's all speculation and risk. So the oil industry, the multinationals, gain tremendously in that equation. They have access to data. They're able to bid with greater knowledge than the public has, and as a consequence, the public gets ripped off on underbid, low bid royalty basis for production. And it's a big problem and will become an increasing problem as energy issues continue to move into the limelight nationally. And what we do on tax policy and developmental policy really needs to be scrutinized moving forward, because really the driver behind HAARP and many of these technologies are multinational corporations and their version of what's required in a civil society, which is quite contrary to what most people think is rational.
Now, that's interesting. I mean, you're basically stating that these multinational corporations, these oil companies, have every bit of oil inside of the earth mapped out, basically.
Well,
Dr. Nick, will you again please start telling us about HAARP?
Sure. The HAARP system is HAARP, and it's the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project operating here in Alaska, approximately 250 miles northeast of Anchorage. And it's a field of antennas, an array, if you will, which is 180 antennas are in the array. Each is about 70 feet tall, 72 feet tall, and then a cross dipole running perpendicular to the ground about 60 feet across. So a field of these, 180 in all, and what they actually do is focus or concentrate radio frequency energy into a relatively small area, and then by modulating it and shaping the energy itself, they actually couple to the ionosphere in a way that causes ionosphere to respond sympathetically to the instrument on the ground. You can think about it as just sort of plugging in, if you will, to the ionosphere for certain applications. In other uses, they can actually use the naturally occurring magnetic field lines that surround the Earth and literally wrap the energy around those field lines in such a way as to create an acceleration of electrons that would actually create an artificial missile shield using essentially instruments like HAARP on the ground. But those are just a few of the uses for the system. It's actually pretty versatile considering what it can do with radio frequency energy.
Now, does it...
the world, or the only technology that can affect weather systems or other geophysical systems.
Now, I could see definite advantages. I'm thinking commodities right now off the top of my head. I mean, if you had a bunch of we know the Wall Street guys would never steal anything from us, but I could just imagine the money that could be made off of crop manipulation.
Well, there's a lot to be said for that, certainly. One of the more interesting applications of HAARP, however, is what's called earth-penetrating tomography, which is one of the reasons ARCO got excited, Atlantic Richfield, when they were first involved in this project before they sold it off, is this earth-penetrating tomography is like underground imaging. It's like, by analogy or comparison, it would be similar to like X-raying the Earth, only in this case you're using radio frequency energy, and it can actually get a very good resolution, and they proved this back in 1995 when HAARP that year was funded under non-proliferation and counter-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and the deal was, after the first Gulf War, they wanted to make sure that the underground imaging would be effective for underground facilities of various kinds. And then the other thing that came out of that was the ability to look and locate underground gas, oil fields of various grades, determine underground water reservoirs and certain types of minerals would also be defined here with a great deal of accuracy, like 99% accuracy in terms of where things were located. Intentional, uninformed user. And Dr. Eastland is now deceased. He passed away in 2007. So really the genius behind the technology is no longer around, and had not been attached to the project for well over a decade when he passed away.
Now, I've talked to several people that have, when I'm looking at the Weather Channel and I'm seeing the radar, and I know several people that are really hardcore into HAARP, and they say, look, that's a HAARP wave stopping that weather front there, and there it is again. And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is that what we're actually seeing, like when we're watching like the Weather Channel and we see a radar picture that just doesn't look quite normal?
Could be. There's a lot of systems that could account for this. Actually, in weather modification, there are several private companies and governments that have offered to provide that service for a fee. And so you would really have to look more closely, and this is the thing, is the signatures on these things should be pretty distinct. They should be noticeable and observable by anyone with the technology. And then secondly, the idea of being able to triangulate where those signals are coming from and how they're being broadcast is relatively simple for, again, a sophisticated government with the same capability. So it's not a technology that you can, hide in a silo. It identifies itself every time it's used if there's independent monitoring, and that is the problem with the technology. There is no independent monitoring. The system is used intermittently as we understand it today, and it's not the only transmitter like it in